Welcome to another episode of That's Some Crazy Shit with Kelly and James. My name is Kelly, but you knew that. And my co-host is Mr. James. You knew that too.
But yeah, you knew that too. It wasn't a cliffhanger.
It wasn't new. But hey, we got a really cool guest today, James. Oh, but I didn't say, how are you, James? Welcome. How is life?
Things are good. You know, weather's nice. You know, I have a nice view out the corner studio.
Yep.
Leaves are changing.
Although by the time they hear this, it will be February and incredibly cold.
Leaves have changed and fallen. They were pretty though.
They were pretty. So today we have a guest, and usually when we, that's some crazy shit. We've had people from, the paranormal. We've had physicians, we've had psychics, but this time we have Dr. Paul Kahan, who is an author and a historian. He actually got his Ph.D. from Temple University, and he wrote this book about State Penitentiary, which is a prison in the Philadelphia area, and just him talking about the history of prisons. Prison in itself is some crazy shit. I personally have never been, don't have any desire to go, but when you really look at the prison system in this country, James, it is some crazy shit.
It is some crazy shit, and it's cool because now my experience with Eastern State is, from the paranormal side, and so I thought it would be interesting to see, what his opinion of it was. And then we end up learning all this other stuff about how the design affected the designs of, to come and stuff. That was interesting, cool dude.
Very interesting, and just about prisons in general, really, and just the prison system in this country, which I'm going to say it again, is some crazy shit. So I think we should just get right to it.
Well, let's do it, my friend.
Welcome to the podcast, author and historian, Paul Kahan. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast and joining me and James on That Some Crazy Shit. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this for several weeks, so I'm so glad we get to talk about one of the topics that is near and dear to my heart.
So you are an author and you are a PhD. So I'm curious, how did this book, Eastern State Penitentiary, a history, how did that go? How did that become a book? Why did you decide to publish this information?
That's a great question. So when I was in college, when I started college in the fall of 1998, I thought I was going to become a high school English teacher. So I started studying English literature and education classes. And one of the things that I realized was, what is the one author that every high school student throughout his or her career has to read? It's William Shakespeare. So I thought, well, that would be a good person to know a lot about. And so I took a lot of courses in Shakespeare studies related to Shakespeare. And Alfred University, where I attended, had just launched a minor called Medieval and Renaissance Studies. And you could take half your classes in the English department, but the other half you had to take through the history department. So I took some additional classes in the history department, found out I actually enjoyed that much more than the English literature courses. And by the time I was finished, I was 3/4 of the way to a degree. So the history department was like, well, why don't you take 2 more courses and finish out your degree? And I did that, and I decided, okay, I want to do this for a living. I'm going to go to grad school. But I knew when I went to grad school that I wanted to do something that was related to policy. I was starting grad school in the first year of the Bush administration. Things seemed like they were awful and, couldn't get any worse. And boy, was I wrong. And so I wanted to do something about policy. How can history teach us about policy? So initially I went and I studied the history of religious education. And for one reason or another, the master's program I was in just wasn't getting me to where I wanted to go. So when I finished my master's degree, I went to Temple University to work with Bill Cutler, who was a well-known historian of education. And while I was at Temple, I happened to get a job doing tours at Eastern State Penitentiary. And so I'm sitting there hour after hour talking to people, and, they're asking questions about it. And if you look at the map of the prison, it's clear that there were educational places. There were places that at various times served as classrooms, places that served as rooms where inmates could learn a trade. And no one had really written about the history of prison education. So I decided to do that for my doctoral dissertation. But before I could do that, I knew I needed a really, really in-depth history of the prison. So I would know who was the warden, what were the politics of the prison, what was going on. So that's the book that became Eastern State Penitentiary, a History. I was fascinated as I was studying that, and I thought, gee, if it's this interesting to me, it's going to be interesting to visitors to the prison. It's going to be interested to people that are interested in these, when you think about it, unique and somewhat unusual institutions. And so as a result, I took some time off writing my dissertation to write Eastern State Penitentiary, a History, published it, and the rest, as they say, is history.
So what is it about this prison that is so unique? Why would you do a whole book on this prison in particular, this prison?
Yeah, that's a good question. And on the one hand, I want to say Eastern State Penitentiary is unique, but on the other hand, Eastern State Penitentiary has a lot of features that are very similar to almost every American prison in the country. And so it's a really weird sort of existence. The unique elements really boil down to architecture and to the system of rehabilitation that was imposed when the prison opened. The prison opened in 1829. The initial building was complete in 1836. And the prison adopted what was called the Pennsylvania system, which mandated that individuals be separated from one another, that they be isolated from one another. Because the theory was that individuals didn't just commit crimes because, they were starving or because they were in need. They committed crimes because they were bad people. And that in order to reform them, and think about what that means, reform them, you needed to take them out of the negative environments in which they were living, which were largely urban environments like Philadelphia. You needed to place them in an institution where almost every aspect of their lives was tightly controlled, and use that time as a way of turning them into a new human being, breaking them down and turning them into a new human being. And in order to do that, you needed a very, very specialized architectural system. And this is a rendering of Eastern State Penitentiary from above. And what you can see is a building, a square wall, and on the inside, cell blocks that radiate out from this central location known as center. They go out like spokes on a wheel. And if we can get really, really close there, you can see that's cell block number 2. And what you see is the top part, this part in the middle, is where the cell blocks were, this sort of darker part, and then these were exercise yards. So every inmate had a cell that was attached to an exercise yard. And the inmates spent about 23 hours a day alone in their cell, where they would work at a trade, shoemaking, woodworking, sewing, etc. But then they would be taken out into their exercise yard and given the ability to work out, grow some plants, maybe have an animal in that exercise yard. No neighbors were ever in their exercise yards at the same time because, of course, they weren't supposed to communicate with one another. The idea was you didn't know who was in the prison with you, because if you did, it would totally diminish your ability to re-enter society. If someone could say, James, I remember you were at Eastern State Penitentiary with me, you'd never be able to put that behind you. And now, of course, ironically, we have a system that's designed to prevent you from doing that, to ensure that throughout the rest of your life, you wear the scarlet letter of having been incarcerated. But they took it to absurd extremes. They would bring you in, you'd be wearing a mask, you would be led into the prison, you would have no idea where in the prison you were. They would take you to your cell, you'd enter through your exercise yard, and you would have no idea. Am I on the east side of the prison, the north side of the prison? Where am I? What are the barriers preventing me from leaving? All these kinds of things.
Wow.
And so it's a moment where architecture and penal philosophy come together and reinforce one another. Now, of course, if you're going to do that, if you're going to incarcerate someone like that, the infrastructure needs to be unimaginable. I mean, imagine what you need if I'm going to keep you in a room 23 hours a day. You're going to need indoor plumbing. And this is in an era when President Andrew Jackson is using an outhouse in the White House. These cells had indoor plumbing. But the pipes need to come out into the hallway and run along the wall so that if you're trying to tap out a message, the guards can hear it and put a stop to it. So it's an attempt to use architecture to impose a total control on the inmate's existence, if that makes sense.
Was this a philosophy of, I don't know what I want to call it, mental health at the time, or is it more from the prison system that it made this the way it was with the building and things like that?
Yeah, so this is a period where we don't recognize mental health issues as mental health issues. Of course, there were people that had mental health issues, and it caused them to act out in a variety of different ways. There was a very lively debate during this period about whether or not people were driven insane by being in Eastern State Penitentiary, and author Charles Dickens, who visited the prison in 1842, wrote scathingly about the prison, believed that it did drive people insane. But it's equally likely that those people were insane to begin with, committed a crime, and then were just thrown in this institution because there was no other institution. But this particular form of penology was one of two systems in the United States. So this is the Pennsylvania system, and it's based on benevolence, right? It's based on the idea that you are a human being that we can save. And yes, we're going to go to extremes to do that, but we are going to try and save you. The other system is the New York system, and that is most associated with Sing Sing in New York, which rather than having all of the cell blocks radiate like spokes from a wheel, what they would do is they would build the cell blocks up 1, 2, 3, 4, and then surround them with a concrete building. And if you've ever been to somewhere like Alcatraz, that is the structure of Alcatraz. You've got cells that come up against each other in a line, and then they are surrounded by a building. And then that building is in turn surrounded by a wall. And that ultimately eclipses the Pennsylvania system because it's cheap. Those cells, even though inmates are in their cells the majority of the time, they're brought out during the day to be worked in factories that were built on the prison grounds. Rather than running water, they were given a toilet, or they were given a bucket to use at night. And they didn't bother running the pipes out along the walls because if they heard you talking, they'd go into your cell and beat the shit out of you. And that worked to keep people silent. So the brutality of an institution like that is much greater than the brutality of an institution like the Pennsylvania system, but it's also much cheaper. And in an era of, where taxes were collected in the form of tariffs and other forms of indirect taxation rather than income taxes or business taxes, cheaper is always going to be better. And today we still run our prisons as cheaply as possible, which helps account for why they are such awful institutions.
When did Eastern State Penitentiary close?
So Eastern State Penitentiary closed in 1971. The last inmates left in 1971. It was closed as a state institution the year before, And then there was a riot at the city jail in Holmesburg, Philadelphia, and they put some inmates from that institution in Eastern State for a few months. And then they were taken out, and Eastern State officially closed in 1971.
And so did anybody, or is there any documentation, was anybody ever truly reformed from these techniques?
So that's a really good question. And I've been through the records. And here's the problem with that. If you could get in a time machine and go back in time and talk to members of the Pennsylvania Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, which is the volunteer organization that initially got the legislature to put money into the prison and then ran it, they would say, absolutely, we are doing that. We have a very small number of people who are incarcerated a second time. We have almost no people who are incarcerated a third time, a couple a fourth time. But think about when you're talking about. You're talking about the 1830s, the 1840s, the 1850s. There's no social security numbers. Fingerprinting is in its infancy. People can change their identities as simply as moving to a new town and saying, call me Jack, I'm Jack. And there's every incentive to lie about how many times you've been incarcerated. If you go in front of a judge and it's the fifth time you've been arrested and convicted for larceny, you're not going to tell the judge that because he's likely to give you a longer sentence. So you have every incentive to say, no, first time in jail. In addition, the prison has every incentive to lie about the number of people who are brought back to the prison, because they are locked in this contest between themselves and the New York system. And they can't argue we're cheaper. So what is Eastern State Penitentiary supporters going to argue? We're better. Well, what's the metric of better? The metric of better is no recidivism.
Interesting. So during the time that the penitentiary was open, were there any officers or staff that were injured or killed?
Oh my goodness, yes, there were lots of them. What happens is, you have to understand, in the early years of the prison's existence, there's no formal mechanism for training prison guards. Professional, organized police forces, as we understand them, don't exist for more than 30 years after the prison is organized.
Wow.
I mean, these guys are just showing up in their work clothes and basically doing the best that they can. Now, in the early years of the prison's existence, from let's say 1829 to the end of the Civil War in 1865, that's largely good enough because the Pennsylvania system is working the way it's supposed to be, more or less, which means it's one inmate to a cell. Inmates are not interacting with each other. Where there are breakdowns in the system, that's where you see escapes. So for instance, women are allowed out of their cells to do cooking and cleaning around the prison because it saves money. Well, this of course becomes a way for them to escape. The first noted escape at the prison comes when an inmate is taken from his cell and ordered to work the warden's New Year's party. The warden lived in Eastern State during this period, and he just waited till all the warden's friends got drunk and passed out, and then he opened up a window, tied some bed sheets together, lowered himself down the front of the prison, and out he went. So it was those breakdowns. Yeah, it was those breakdowns in the prison system that ultimately allowed for things like that to happen. But, there would be violence against guards in some instance. Once we get into the latter part of the 19th century, where that Pennsylvania system is cracking in a lot of different ways, you start seeing inmate on inmate violence. You also start seeing inmate on guard violence, because now you're packing 2 and sometimes 3 inmates to the cells. You're not isolating them. You're taking them out of the cells so they can work in factory style work environments rather than in their cells. And anytime that you have an interaction with an inmate, with an incarcerated person, there is a possibility of violence, a possibility of guard on incarcerated person violence or the possibility of incarcerated person on guard violence. So yeah, that's where we see charming things like in the 1880s, a guard opened the prison door and the inmate was inside and he was holding a package. And he said, "I made something for you." And so he hands it through the bars. The guard unwraps it and finds it was his cellmate's head wrapped up in a bed sheet. So yeah, you get charming stories like that.
So the prison is closed now. Are there accounts of there being like paranormal activity at the prison now since it's been closed from all the things that have happened?
Yes. So there are several murders, accidental deaths, all these kinds of things. And as a result, beginning in the 1990s, when you have the prison reopen as a museum, you start to get rumors of paranormal activity. You start to get rumors of ghostly interventions. And of course, in the early 2000s, there's this spike in interest in the paranormal led by shows like Ghost Hunters and Zach What's-His-Face's Ghost
Adventures.
Yeah, there you go. And all those copycats. And so they start coming to Eastern State Penitentiary to, do investigations. And when I was a docent there, it was great money accompanying these groups because it was time and a half. So I would inevitably sign up for that. I'd go grab dinner, come back, and between, say, 9 and 2 or 10 and 3, I'd be accompanying these people. And some of them would use Ouija boards, some of them would use religious icons, some of them would use scientific equipment, some of them would adopt techniques in between to investigate the prison. So yeah, I mean, it was a big money maker, not only for me, but for Eastern State Penitentiary as well.
So what did you ever see anything?
No. Not a single thing. I spent probably 40 hours in the prison at night with ghost organizations. I would review their footage with them. I never saw anything.
So how many people were incarcerated there at one time at its maximum?
That's a good question. There would be several thousand incarcerated, and that really the prohibition really drives the prison almost to the breaking point. In fact, Eastern State Penitentiary was going to be retired and replaced by Graterford Prison, which was in suburban Montgomery County. And it was actually referred to as the new Eastern State Penitentiary, and it opened in 1929, 100 years after Eastern State. And the idea was that Eastern State Penitentiary would close and that inmates would be sent to Eastern State or to Graterford. And the implementation of prohibition, coupled with the rise of organized crime, and then later the Depression, creates this toxic mix of massive crime that leads to not only Eastern State Penitentiary being overflowing, but Graterford being overflowing. And so as a result, Eastern State gets a few more decades of life. In addition, Eastern State Penitentiary occupies an entire city block, right? So as you can see, it's a massive, massive structure that is built to last. And in the 70s and the 80s, when it's closed, there were several arguments about whether or not what the city should do with it. And the answer is it's too expensive to demolish. And it's on the National Historic Register. So it's also a very difficult institution. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to honor that legacy? And it's just so expensive that they just keep it because, why spend the money? And that's why it exists today. And it actually has outlasted Graterford Prison, which a year or two ago closed and was replaced by State Correctional Institution, Phoenixville.
In the history of the prison, did you find that there was a disproportionate amount of maybe African Americans to, say, Caucasians in the prison or Hispanics in the prison, or, you know, was that population more on the African American side?
Absolutely. And I mean, this is one of those things. Knowing the world as you do, you have certain expectations about what you're going to find, and every single one of them was justified. I just finished writing a history of Philadelphia, and one of the dominant themes is the pervasive racism of Philadelphia and Philadelphians. You know, Pennsylvania is a quote unquote free state in the 19th century. There's a gradual abolition law that's passed in 1718 that begins radically driving down the number of enslaved people in Philadelphia. And so you end up with a very large free Black population and a very vibrant free Black community in Philadelphia. But this is a community that faces almost unbelievable racism and violence against it. And those dynamics work to ensure that those individuals would get caught up in the criminal justice system, such as it was, that they would be convicted, that they would be sent to Eastern State Penitentiary in numbers vastly above their proportion of the population. And that, of course, is what you see. They're obviously never a majority in the prison, but Black people make up a much larger percentage of incarcerated people at Eastern State Penitentiary than you would expect, just based on their percentage as a portion of the population. And don't forget that the federal government is mandating by the 1850s that state organizations become involved in recapturing escaped enslaved people. And so those mechanisms are being used to ensure that Black people, whether they were formerly incarcerated or had been free and were just, slave catchers were trying to, drag them south, they're ending up in county jails, they're ending up all over the place in these institutions. So you have all these kind of structural things that are pushing African Americans into institutions like Eastern State Penitentiary. But an even bigger issue is that for most of its existence, the people being incarcerated at Eastern State Penitentiary are poor people who committed nonviolent economic crimes, right? They're stealing horses, they're stealing food, they're stealing money. It's that sort of, because the 19th century is this period of rapid economic change and economic growth and it's just unrestrained capitalism in some way that creates these boom and bust cycles. When the economy busts, it busts profoundly. My book, The Bank War, is about why this economic system exists the way it does when this isn't the case in other countries. And it's because of it's in part because of Andrew Jackson's showdown with the Bank of the United States, which is headquartered in Philadelphia, and basically provides a stabilizing mechanism in the economy. Well, once Jackson kills the bank, the economy has no stabilizing mechanism. And so it's boom and bust. And those economic, gyrations lead to a flood of inmates into this institution.
Do you teach, Paul?
I have in the past. Currently, I'm the executive director of the American Helicopter Museum and Education Center, which means that in addition to signing checks and writing grant reports, I also plunge toilets. But I do so with style.
Wow, the history of that institution is fascinating. I want to thank you for coming on that some crazy shit and sharing. I think it's fascinating. I asked you if you teach because I'm just hanging on every word. It's like, so it's so interesting though. At least it is to me. So I really enjoyed having you on. So thank you.
Before we go, can I show you one other artifact that I pulled down?
Yes.
Okay. So what you are looking at right here is a pass to get into the prison that was printed and disseminated by the Pennsylvania Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. And as I said to you, if, they wanted inmates isolated from each other, but Eastern State Penitentiary, from the moment it opened, was a tourist attraction akin to a zoo. So people would actually go to the prison, respectable people. They would have this pass, which demonstrated that the PSAMP said, yes, this is a respectable person. And they would visit with inmates. And they would stand there and watch them as if they were standing in a zoo. So it's one of those things that I think it's prisons have always inspired a certain element of torture porn, and prison museums as they exist today and prison television shows have a long history going back to things like this. And I would hope that your listeners would think about that when it comes to visiting these institutions and the things that they see.
Wow. Thank you again for sharing.
Sure.
Appreciate having you on. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, guys.
That was Paul's. It's funny. I think I say this every week, but Paul was a cool dude. He's very educated man, has a lot of knowledge, and he can, I guess, share it with you in a way that you can understand and find it interesting. Because now it's funny because it's like, now I want to learn more about these old penitentiaries in terms of how they were designed and stuff,
and why they were designed like that.
Yeah, why they were designed that way, and
there was a method to the way they designed prisons, and how Eastern State would keep people. You only got 1 hour of outside time.
Yeah.
And the rest of the time you were isolated. They believed that was the way to rehab people. But then the prison got crowded, so now you've got 3 people in a little box and all types of stuff going on. Wow. If his book again is called Eastern State Penitentiary, The History, it's on Amazon. I enjoyed speaking with him. That was some crazy shit.
Yeah, very informative, very crazy. And I think, I like our show, Kel, because we have so many things come on, and now it's like here's another little path I can go down and learn about.
Yeah, and I guess if you've never really thought about the prison system, or if you thought you knew about the prison system in this country, Paul definitely shed some light on it, and knowing that prisons were designed with a method to the madness, right? There was a reason why they look the way that they look.
Yeah, and how it's affected how prisons are still designed.
Yeah.
And I think it's funny because, he was talking about how prisons were overcrowded then, and they had all these problems. How many hundreds of years later, they're still dealing with the same problems? Exactly.
100%. So you can get us on our website,
That'ssomecrazyshit.com.
That'ssomecrazyshit.com. And there's all of our social media. You can go listen to past episodes. You can read James's blog. And until next week, James, I don't have anything else, so that's why I'm just saying.
Random bullshit. How about you have the opportunity to invite 2 guests to dinner from the past. Who do you invite, and what are you making?
Are they dead or living?
Let's say you can choose one of each. Want me to go first?
Yeah.
All right, so I would invite Leonardo da Vinci.
Okay.
And I would invite Obama.
Okay. What are we having?
And I would make them my Valley famous shredded chicken and green chili with Spanish rice and black beans.
Sounds good. I think I would invite Buddha, the original.
So it has to have a vegan meal.
Right? And then I think I would invite Keanu Reeves. I
Yeah, you have to have vegan.
We would have a vegan extravaganza.
Yeah.
I would even go vegan that night, even though secretly I would have some meat stashed in the oven. But we would all do a vegan whatever. I don't know. I'm not vegan, so
you could do a meat shot.
We can do a pasta. Yep.
Yeah.
So we're gonna do a pasta, and we'll figure out a way to make it an alternative. But we're having pasta, some type of vegan Alfredo.
Oh, that sounds good.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, your daughter Rebecca's a chef. Just steal a recipe from her.
Well, she'd be the one making it. See?
Oh, that don't. Now, it wasn't who you gonna have cook for you.
You never said I couldn't have anybody cook for me.
Yeah.
You just said, what are we having? I told you. So, I was gonna invite Jesus Christ, but I think I want to talk to Buddha first. So the next time that I get to invite a person to dinner, living and dead, my other one would be Christ. And then I probably would want to invite Hitler too, because I'd want to talk to him, pick his brain, see what was up.
That would be interesting, Christ and Hitler.
Yeah, Christ and Hitler, I think, just to see see how they view one
the
another.
Dichotomy.
Yeah, and I think too, I would also want to invite Nostradamus as well, because he seems like an interesting dude too.
Yeah, Tesla
and King Leonidas, because I want to see if the Spartans really have those abs.
Well, the Spartans were bad.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I'm going to invite one of them to dinner. I figure it might as well be the king.
That's true. Now, what if he showed up and he had like a dad bod?
Then you know what? I'm sick. I'm sorry. We can't do dinner tonight.
We have COVID in the 21st century.
You might as well go back. Go back. Gotta have the abs, because I've already got a thought in my head of what they should look like. So if it doesn't look like what I think it should look like, then it's probably not going to work.
Yeah, I can see King Leonidas with the 6-pack, 8-pack comes up. I'm King Leonidas. Are you Kelly? Well, yes, I am.
Yes.
And then there's dad bod King Leonidas. Walk up to Kelly. Are you Kelly? Why, no, I don't know who Kelly is.
Mm-hmm. 2 houses down, maybe?
Yeah, I think maybe you should take your dad bod a couple doors down.
Yeah. Sorry. No, you're supposed to be king of the Spartans. Anyway, I digress. I'm sorry. But yeah, that's who I would invite. Buddha and Keanu Reeves. We're having pasta.
All right on. How was that for random bullshit?
That was incredibly random. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
I know.
Until next time.
Keep your minds open, people.